Hello, everyone. I hope you have had a nice break, and I'm welcoming everyone back to our regional consultation on harnessing trade for faster recovery and sustainable development, which is organized in preparation for the next World Trade Organization ministerial conference that is scheduled for November. The session this afternoon will be dealing with a very important set of issues aiming towards lessening the damages to the environment that we have had experienced over many decades. And trade, of course, is an important avenue through which we can collectively do that, but it is important for everyone to actually come around the table and discuss the issue and agree on the steps and the path towards that. And of course, the talks and programs that are set in the WTO with respect to that agenda is super important. And so we are very pleased that we are able to organize this session this afternoon. I am now also very pleased to introduce Ms. Huda Ali Sharif. She is a Deputy Ambassador of Maldives and Permanent Representative to United Nations ESCAP in Bangkok. And so she will be moderating the session. So Ms. Huda, floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mia, and a very good afternoon to everyone. Let me start this session by highlighting the compelling scientific evidence regarding climate change. The IPCC report concluded that the warming of the Earth's climate is unequivocal and that human activities are very likely the cause of this warming. And much of the sectors of the global economy are expected to be affected by climate change, and these impacts will often have implications for trade. Therefore, it's imperative that we understand the linkages between trade and climate change. And we know that the trade intersects with climate change in a multitude of ways. For example, governments may introduce a variety of policies such as regulatory measures and economic incentives to address climate change. This complex web of measures will certainly have an impact on international trade and the multilateral trading system. As such, this session is on climate change and trade. On climate change and trade is timely and very important. With these brief remarks, let's begin the presentations from our distinguished panel of experts. And just before we start off, I'll just remind everyone that the session is being recorded. And we'll be running these sessions first, the introduction of the topic by the experts, and then comments from the governments, and Q&A session, Q&As from participants. So the experts will be presenting for about 15 to 20 minutes their presentations, and we will take the questions afterwards. So let me introduce, which presentation is it first, me?
Mr. Holim Aik from the WTO.
All right. Yes, let me introduce Mr. Aik Lim, Director Trade and Environment Division, WTO, who will be presenting the trade and climate change update on the recent work at the WTO. You may take the floor, Mr. Ho.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, and also thanks to Mia and to the colleagues at ESCAP for this invitation for this very important regional consultation. What I will do is that I will share with you some slides, and I need to ask the organizers, should I show it from my screen and share my screen, or will you be putting it on? I wasn't too sure on that point.
I am certain that you were given the co-host to share. So
Okay.
can you please try?
I'll do that. Okay. It should be coming on.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Just kindly put it to the presentation mode.
Okay, no problem. Okay. That's good.
Yes, very nice. Oh,
Now,
we have see your notes. How if
it's
you
all
want
right.
to, it's
I
okay.
don't have
All right.
many. I don't have many notes anyway.
Okay. All right.
I don't have any
Okay.
notes nearly. Now, the topic of trade and climate change is a very big one. So, as you know, as Madam Moderator Huda, you mentioned, it's a systemic change, changing virtually everything. So, in this presentation, of course, is going to be a bit more limited. I will not be speaking on the whole scope of trade and climate change. And what I'll be really doing is to give you a little bit more of an insight on how these measures intersect with the WTO. And then more particularly, what type of recent work has been happening in the WTO context. So with that, let me start with my first slide. You know, we at the WTO have an environmental database. This was a work that was asked of us to do by the Committee on Trade and Environment. It's a very long-standing work. It goes back to nearly 1995. And over the years, what we've been doing is tracking every notification that comes to the WTO, as well as studying trade policy reviews. The methodology is a fairly simple one. It was asked for and approved by the committee, which is that we look at the notifications and we try to understand what in these notifications could be said to be environment related. Now, I won't go in great detail, but the reason why I show you this slide is just to say that, you know, it's an area that has, of course, been growing. You know, over the years, the basic trend is upwards. You see more and more notifications that contain environmental related objectives in one way or another. The numbers here basically are annual numbers. They're numbers of looking at each notification and seeing what proportion of them could be said to be environment related. I wouldn't worry too much about the numbers. I mean, you know, these are, you know, it's a very simple methodology. It's more the trend, I think, which is what I wanted to show you. So an increasing trend of environment related notifications. So what does this mean? Well, firstly, you know, currently we have something like 14,100 environmental measures notified to WTO between 2009, 2019. Quite a wide spread of members notify these measures, over 100 members or so. According to our methodology, and I have to say it's only a methodology, we consider something like 4,000 over are related to climate change. It's a very difficult category because, as I said at the beginning, climate change cuts across so many things. So it's only an estimate. And then why I want to show you this is that the relationship between environment and trade is not abstract. Okay? It appears in measures. Measures are taken. Measures fall under WTO agreements. So there's a growing trend. And these are just notifications, okay? Nothing more than that. Now, I think this realization that there's a link between trade and environment is not a new one, of course, as you all know, it's quite old. And in the WTO system, it's been going on more formally with the establishment of the Committee on Trade and Environment since 1994 with WTO Ministerial Declaration. And the aim is to try to ensure that we have a dialogue and discussion at the WTO that can help ensure that trade and environmental policies are mutually supportive. And in the committee, we try to understand links between trade and environmental policies. A lot of this comes through presentations by members themselves about their own national experiences. And in this discussion, since of course it's a trade-based discussion, one clear pillar of the discussion is to try to avoid green protectionism, strengthening the positive interaction between trade and the environment. Now, topics change over time, okay? And here I'm just listing some of the big topics that have been discussed in the CTE over the last few years. Some of them you may know well, some maybe less so. You know, it ranges from fossil fuel subsidies, reform, circular economy and plastics, carbon footprint schemes or carbon standards, different elements of how climate mitigation and adaptation policies have been taken, eco-labeling, illegal logging, illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing. To be clear, this is not the negotiations on fishery subsidies. Fishery subsidies is happening in the rules negotiating group, but nevertheless, the CTE does have exchanges about the whole aspect of IUU fishing. Very lately, you know, because the CTE is an established committee, at the same time, we have seen some members, groups of members, have started to want to go deeper or maybe even take another step further, if I can say, on trade and environment. And they have formulated two initiatives. One is the trade and environmental sustainability structured discussions, and another one is the so-called informal dialogue on plastics pollutions and environmental sustainable plastics trade. These are quite new. Let me start with the first one, which is a very broad discussion. In short, it's called TESD. It's led by a number of countries, but the coordinators are Canada and Costa Rica. They launched it just last year, actually, in 17 November 2020. Currently, one could say that some 53 WTO members, including the EU, counting the individual EU member states, are part of this initiative. It's an open-ended discussion. It's open to all WTO members. So whether you are a co-sponsor or not a co-sponsor, you can be part of it. And it's looking again to intensify work and dialogue and discussion on trade and environmental sustainability, and trying to go a bit deeper to look at what type of concrete actions could be taken. Interesting facet is that the discussions are open to a selected or invited stakeholders. At least they are engaging with stakeholders. Here you get the list of the actual countries who are currently more formally co-sponsoring this. As I said, it's been only 1 year, but it's been quite intense. They've had 3 meetings so far. They will have another one on 16 September. Most of the meetings are quite technical. They're basically led by technical panel discussions. And they try to go deeper in the range of subjects which I had mentioned earlier. But this maybe gives you a better way to look at it. Okay? They mainly discuss issues related to environmental goods and services, circular economy, or how to get towards a circular economy. Very lately, there has been some new suggestions to discuss sustainable agriculture, and particularly sustainable production and sourcing. And there's also a discussion on environmental impacts of subsidies. Tends to be about fossil fuel subsidies. And what these members seek to do, or they're trying to do, is to work towards a joint declaration for MC12. The other initiative that is also ongoing is much more sector focused. This is much more on plastics. A group of members felt it to be a very important topic, and they believe that trade should also play a role or contribute to dealing with plastics pollution and to encourage more environmentally sustainable plastics trade. So here are the key coordinators from Australia, Barbados, China, Ecuador, Fiji, Morocco, again launched last year in November 2020. There are about 17 members currently who are co-sponsors. You have the list of the co-sponsors here. Again, it's a very open discussion, all members invited to join. They realize, of course, that they are not, or WTO is not an environmental organization per se. So what they try to do is to see how their discussions can complement work in other fora. And they focus particularly on how improved trade cooperation can help. And the question for the group is a little bit this, actually. What do they mean by trade cooperation? And what are the ways by which trade cooperation could help? So they try to answer these questions by focusing on 6 main topics: improving transparency, monitoring trade trends, promoting best practices, strengthening policy coherence, trying to find collective approaches or scope for such collective approaches, and assessing, capacity technical needs, and also dealing with international processes, because as I said, we are not necessarily the main fora for environmental discussions. And again, they are looking towards preparing a ministerial declaration for MC12. Just last week, we WTO provided the premises to 4 governments, not under WTO, but under the UN process, because they wanted to host a ministerial on plastics. So they did have this ministerial here at WTO, and the IDP members held a side event at the same time, and they basically emphasize again that that trade can play a positive role. And how do we understand the positive role? It's basically because it's unavoidable. If you want to reduce the amount of plastics, you need to look at the plastics value chain, supply chain. Currently about 50% of plastics, sorry, I should start again. I should say that currently about only 9% of plastic circulating is actually recycled. And that figure dates back to 1950s. So of all the plastics circulating, only 9% is actually been able to be recycled. Yet at the same time, plastics is embedded in virtually everything, in all goods. So plastic flows go from upstream to downstream. So this is one of the questions: what role can trade play? That is the end of my very, very quick summary of really recent work. Okay, I hope that through this explanation of recent work, you get a bit of a sense of the linkage to trade and climate change. As I say, one can go deeper, but I'll leave it here, and then maybe Jan will pick up on some of these things and we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lim. And now the next presentation is by Mr. Jan Duval, Chief of Trade Policy and Facilitation, OIC, Trade and Investment Innovation Division, ESCAP, presenting on Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021, Accelerating Climate Smart Trade and Investment for Sustainable Development. Mr. Duval, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. I hope you can see my slides. And so let me try not to take too much time. Thank you very much, for the introductory presentation as well. I think it's important to realize that the WTO is focusing on trade and environment, which is a much bigger topic than trade and climate change. And in fact, I mean, there is a link to climate change, but from the key initiative I saw you presenting, climate change may not be at the center of it at this point, right? So maybe you'll be able to clarify this a bit later. What I'm going to do here is give you a preview of the Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021, which is actually work in progress. It's upcoming. In principle, is going to be launched on the side of the next WTO Committee on Trade and the Environment on 11 October. So the slide, I'm going to show the slide, but we're not going to make them available after the meeting because in principle, they are still confidential. But let me move forward. The app here is on accelerating climate smart trade and investment for sustainable development. So this is joint work with between ESCAP, UNEP, and UNTAD. And so the idea really is to recognize that yes, globalization has lifted billions of people out of poverty in the Asia-Pacific region alone, thanks to trade and investment and open trade and investment. But this has come also at a steep environmental cost, right? Today, the Asia-Pacific region accounts for 38% of global GDP, but also 54% of the global greenhouse gas emission, which is really the main thing you're trying to address when you try to take climate action, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the new IPCC report that was launched recently that highlight that climate change is man-made based on scientific evidence, right? It's man-made, it's widespread, it's rapid, and it's intensifying. And so what the report is trying to do is trying to focus on how trade and investment related policies can be made more climate smart. So, in a way, help address climate change. So here I'm showing the overview of the report in terms of structure, right? We start with how important the topic is and climate change is. Then we move to the state of play, trying to look at export policies, import policies, investment policies and environment, and also trade facilitation implementation, and see to what extent all those policies related to trade and investment are helpful for reducing CO2 emissions. And then the chapter 3, and 4 and 5 are really much more focused. One is focusing on climate smart business and investment. The next one is looking at the role of regional trade agreements. So we're actually not looking at the multilateral trading system so much. We really are looking more at regional trade agreements as a tool to promote climate smart trade. And then on chapter 5, it's dedicated to climate smart trade and transport, because transport in particular is extremely important. And then chapter 6 looks at the impact of different policy scenarios. So I'm not going to go into all the chapters and the details. So what I wanted to do is just list the 10 recommendations that came out of the report in the analysis. So obviously I can elaborate more later on if there are questions, but here we go. So the first recommendation that came out of the analysis that we've done with UNEP and UNCTAD is there is a need to liberalize trade in climate smart and other environmental goods and services. Right? If you look at the average tariff in the Asia-Pacific region, you find that the tariffs on carbon-intensive fossil fuels in Asia and the Pacific are still lower than the tariff on the environmental goods. Right? So there is definitely scope for work in this area. Obviously, at the WTO, one of the issues that is to be considered is what is an environmental good, right? Do you have a list, right? Is there an agreed list? And again, I think this is still one of the issues that is pending there. The second recommendation that come out of the report is it's important to really focus on phasing out or eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. So this apparently is being discussed also at the WTO. But really, all the modeling we've done in terms of the kind of policies that can have an impact on reducing CO2 emission without really reducing economic growth, fossil fuel subsidies elimination is really a good solution. Obviously, it affects some countries more than others, but that's something that is seems to be helpful, especially since it also, if you eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, you also create fiscal space, right, to address other issues, environmental issues, social issues, once with the subsidies that money you're not spending on the subsidies. The third recommendation that comes out is one on adopting climate smart non-tariff measures. So we've done at ESCAP, we've done quite a bit of work in linking non-tariff measures with sustainable development goals. And we found that about half of the non-tariff measures actually can be directly linked and positively linked to sustainable development goals. So they can actually be a good tool for sustainable development. And this is also true for climate smart and climate action. So here on the slide, we show a few of the NTMs that are related to climate action. For example, in Australia, to address emissions from machinery and vehicles, they impose some regulations and labeling requirements on fuel consumption and energy consumptions of vehicles, right? And this is just one of the examples. The fourth recommendation we have in the report is to encourage climate smart investment and private sector initiatives. So here in the chapter, the idea is to say, okay, you cannot possibly look at all the sectors at once, but at least there is some sectors where you need to take some particular action. So the energy sector is one, because it's a major CO2 emission emitter, looking at increasing the share of renewable energies, for example. Then there is the industrial sector, and there is the transport sector, and there is the construction sectors that have been prioritized for action. And so what kind of action are we talking about? Is possibly, for example, FDI policies that actually promote investment, green investment in those four sectors that I mentioned, but also put more requirements, ask companies to report and to monitor much better their emissions, CO2 emissions, right? So they know what they are doing, and the country can monitor what is really going on. The good news is that some of the big companies are already taking action in this area. And so, for example, some companies of their own initiative are setting up internal carbon pricing mechanisms, where even though the country itself doesn't have a policy and a price on carbon, the company, when making investment decisions, put a price on carbon. So that affects how then they will invest in different technologies or different investments that are greener. They will tend to be greener because there is this price of carbon. The fifth recommendation that we have in the report is to accelerate trade digitalization. And so here the idea is that yes, trade facilitation, trade digitalization can actually increase total trade, right? So this is so that can create more emissions. But at least if you move towards paperless trade, towards trade digitalization, what we can do is reduce the CO2 emissions per transaction. And so one of the studies we've done, background study we've done under this, is to found that each single end-to-end trade transaction undertaken fully digitally can save the equivalent of planting 1.5 trees, right? So that looks small maybe, but if you multiply this by the entire number of trade transactions in Asia Pacific, you get to 400 million trees, right? Equivalent to moving towards trade digitalization. So quite significant. Still, it's not as significant as moving towards or transitioning to climate smart transport, which is the sixth recommendation. Freight transport accounts for a very large share of CO2 emissions. And so this is really where there need to be efforts, right? To reduce CO2 emissions from international transport and freight. So there is a lot of initiative in different sectors by the maritime industry in particular, but also at the government level. One thing that can be done is maybe promote modes of transport that are more less CO2 emitting, right? For example, railway versus road transport. So this is the type of things, initiatives that actually ESCAP has been promoting. The seventh recommendation that comes out is to incorporate climate consideration in regional trade and investment agreement. So obviously, it's great if this can be done at the multilateral level, right? Still best first choice, right? But if it's difficult or too difficult or too slow to do at the multilateral level, it's important to do this also, to try and do this more and more at the regional level. And so what you've seen actually, there is a trend towards this. Many of the new regional trade agreements have at least one climate related provision. So, and then I think some of the emerging climate related provision in those RTAs can actually inform the multilateral WTO trade negotiation in this area. One of the agreement that is, I think, noteworthy and is under negotiation is this agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability that New Zealand is involved in, along with, I think, Costa Rica, Fiji, Norway, I think one more country, Iceland, right? And then they have quite strong provision to reduce tariff on environmental goods, related to climate and implementation of non-tariff measures and so on. The eighth recommendation in the report is to prepare for carbon pricing. So without going into detail, there's a lot of countries now around the world, even developed countries, especially developed countries, who started to implement carbon pricing scheme, either unilaterally or also sub-regionally or regionally. So those schemes don't cover often many sectors. The price of carbon that they put in is not very high in some cases, but this is a growing trend. And so one concern here is that once those countries start putting carbon pricing schemes in place, then their domestic industry, their domestic producers have to pay the price of carbon, right? While the traders or the producers in other countries who don't have such carbon pricing schemes are not paying anything for the price of carbon. So the domestic producers in the countries with carbon pricing scheme are losing competitiveness. So increasingly there is concern about this. The European Union in particular is now thinking to implement carbon CBAM, right? Carbon border adjustment mechanism, and that involves carbon taxes where goods will be taxed for their carbon content, right? Or CO2 emission related content. So that's going to be, this is an issue that is coming, whether developing countries or countries in the region take action in this area or not. There may be taxes, border taxes coming in this area. And so we've done some analysis in the report on this, some quantitative analysis. What we find is that existing carbon pricing comes at an economic cost for the countries we implement them. And it does right now because there is no carbon leakage mechanism in place. So it comes with a marginal windfall for the countries who don't have this. But again, this is, I think, temporary. Now, what we do also is we look at to what extent the EU plus carbon border adjustment mechanism can affect the region, right, when it's implemented. And we actually found that not a lot of changes in terms of gross domestic product in the region, in all the sub-regions, except for South and Southwest Asia, that would be more affected if the EU plus move forward with the scheme. What we find also when doing policy simulation is that imposing global carbon prices of only $10, so a global carbon price, right, can actually reduce emissions in all sub-regions and quite very effectively. So a global carbon price is really the ideal solution. So again, this relates more to the multilateral system, multilateral trading system, Paris Agreement, and so on. But so far, this system has been very elusive. What we also find is that if you actually want to keep the rise of temperature below 2 degrees, you need to have carbon prices above $50 across many sectors. And so this is going to have an impact on the gross domestic product of Asia Pacific countries that range between 0.2% to 0.7% in overall, depending on the sub-region, right? But that's very little cost compared to the cost of climate inaction. One of the last recommendations is on incorporating climate consideration in COVID-19 crisis recovery packages. I think many countries are in the midst of trying to implement and give out subsidies and deploy recovery package for COVID-19 crisis. And so definitely orienting those subsidies and those recovery packages to activities and sectors that are climate friendly would be good. And so here also, I think there is a link to what can be done at the WTO, because there is strong rules at the WTO on subsidies. And so this may actually limit what the countries can really do in this area without breaking rules at the WTO. And then the last recommendation is really to strengthen capacity for climate smart trade and investment policy, because trade, investment, climate nexus, right, and interactions are just very complicated. It's very rare to have an expert who is good at trade, with no trade policy, and who also know environment and climate change issues. And so because of this, I think there is a need for capacity. So that's all we have on the recommendation of the report. And so this is just food for thought for everyone for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Duval, for your presentation. And now, if there are any questions, could you indicate? There was a request from Sri Lanka, Mr. Suresh Dimel, Chairman and Chief Executive, the Export Development Board of Sri Lanka, who had indicated that they want to, that Mr. Suresh has a comment or intervention.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Good afternoon. Trade policies are considered powerful tools to increase resource efficiency, to scale up investment in clean and resilient infrastructure, and to accelerate climate-friendly innovation. In most small economies like Sri Lanka, we have the least capacity to manage the associated risks in economic and social fallouts that we are experiencing already. Furthermore, there is always the risk that international mitigation policies and other measures to combat climate change could also impair our trade competitiveness. Global concern about environmental issues is also driving a growing market for sustainably sourced natural resource-based products. Conscious consumers are demanding more evidence of production that supports fair, ethical, and green practices in the value chains. Furthermore, the certified natural resource-based product market is driving reduction in poverty, as its production is often labor-intensive, and the envisaged premium prices are expected to reach smallholder producers who make up the bulk of the rural poor. This trade is also generating environmental benefits like carbon sequestration in soils and timber, forest preservation, decreased use of agrochemicals, and net biodiversity gains. The national policy framework of the government of Sri Lanka, named Vistas of Prosperity and Splendor, consists of a sustainable environmental policy to achieve development through balanced social, economic, and environmental practices. To this end, the government is focusing on updating environmental regulations for conservation and protection, sustainable consumption, production, and waste-to-resource initiatives, adapting to chemical-free agriculture, achieving 70% renewable energy by 2030, developing an environmentally friendly public transport system, and being a net carbon zero country. Sri Lanka pursues enhanced trade and investment opportunities in economic sectors associated with the transition to a lower carbon or green economy. Sri Lanka has high export concentrations in climate-sensitive sectors, including agriculture, mining, fisheries, forestry, and tourism. The Sri Lankan apparel industry is one of the leading contributors to the Sri Lankan economy and the largest export manufacturing sector in the country. The rising concern about the impacts of climate change has influenced Sri Lanka's major apparel brands to transform to buildings with eco-friendly architecture, with open spaces that invite fresh air and reduce the carbon and water footprint. Sri Lanka is a proud owner of the world's first custom-built green apparel factory and Asia's first carbon-neutral certified factory. These factories received net zero carbon status. Throughout the years, the industry has been operating on par with the production methods of developed countries. Apparel production facilities comply with international environmental standards and requirements. By following eco-friendly practices, these manufacturers have been able to cut energy consumption in half and water consumption by 70%. Circularity is an interesting concept on the sustainability journey, and the Sri Lankan apparel industry is also embarking on maximizing the use of inputs made out of recycled clothing. LEED Platinum and Gold certified manufacturers in Sri Lanka have achieved international standards of recycling, effluent treatment, and waste management. Sri Lanka's tea industry is the second largest export sector of Sri Lanka, and all the tea grown in Sri Lanka is now 100% ozone friendly. As of May 2011, all Ceylon tea is entitled to bear the new ozone-friendly Pure Ceylon tea logo, certifying that it has been produced without the use of any ozone-depleting substances. The global green transformation may offer many opportunities to diversify into new products and services and access technologies for cleaner, more efficient production. New export opportunities in green markets may be important drivers for those economies that manage to secure some market share. To derive benefits from these new trade opportunities, it is imperative to develop and acquire environmentally friendly technologies. While sometimes expensive, but vital for us in maintaining efficiency and competitive edge. Furthermore, one should be mindful that small economies such as Sri Lanka are already facing challenges in participating effectively within the multilateral trading system, where some of these issues are discussed. These economies are often highly reliant on natural resources, and therefore their trade livelihoods, processes, and sectors will be vulnerable to the effects of climate change and environmental degradation. In this respect, Sri Lanka believes that technology transfer is one of the core priorities of developing countries in implementing the 2030 Agenda. The need to accelerate the transfer of technology on favorable terms, including concessional and preferential terms, should be a top priority for the international community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Suresh, for your comments. And I see now I will give the floor to Mr. Lim, who may have comments or intervention on the topic. Mr. Lim.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. No, just a quick reaction, because I thought the two very excellent presentations from Jan and also from Mr. Suresh, and to maybe draw a bit of a link to some of the things that I was speaking about. In Jan's presentation, quite a number of those issues are things that are being discussed in the trade and environment structured discussions, as well as in the CTE. You know, they do talk quite a bit about environmental goods, and to a certain extent services. On the climate smart part on fossil fuel subsidies, there is an ongoing discussion, but more than discussion, you have members who are friends of fossil fuel subsidy reform, and that includes New Zealand, and they have issued a declaration at the Buenos Aires Ministerial, and they will do so again at MC12. Carbon border adjustment, carbon pricing, again in the structured discussions we've had actually now about, I think, 2 different workshops looking at the issue of carbon pricing and carbon border taxes. So just to say that there is very good synergy between what Jan was speaking about and the discussions ongoing. The other point would be, I think Jan mentioned about the lack of definition on environmental goods. My own personal view is that maybe we need to look at this issue a little bit differently. I mean, currently, environmental goods are discussed in WTO, or have been discussed in WTO in the context of a trade negotiation. And in a trade negotiation, not surprisingly, it's a request-offer type negotiation in terms of what I will put on the table versus what you will put on the table, what tariffs you will eliminate versus what tariffs I will eliminate, and so forth. But really, if we're looking at it from a climate lens, the logic is a bit different. The logic is more about, you know, what do you, I mean, as a government, wish to do to enhance your own nationally determined contributions and to therefore contribute to climate action? And what goods do you need in order to be able to do so? And if these goods face very high tariffs, it's a question, should these tariffs be reduced in order to enhance your ability to contribute to climate action? So I'm not sure if you get me completely, but it's a very different logic. It doesn't rely directly on a negotiation in a traditional sense. So from that perspective, you don't need to necessarily have a list of environmental goods. It's whatever goods you consider to be needed if we're looking at it through a climate lens to drive climate action. And that's within your own autonomy to decide. It's a very different question from one where you have a list of goods to negotiate on as such. And then my last very quick point, sorry for taking a bit of time. I thought Mr. Suresh drew very good two new aspects. One is, which is the opportunities that are arising from the new climate economy and the new green economy. And this is what we're seeing. A lot more new opportunities as goods and services are being transformed. And the last point I think he mentioned as well, which is the concerns of climate and their impacts on trade and productive capacity. It's very real, and there's the question of climate adaptation and how can trade be a tool for climate adaptation. So thank you. I just wanted to highlight those points. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Lim. And there was a hand raised by Mr. Atif from Pakistan.
Hello.
Yes, yes.
Yes, thank you so much, Ms. Sharif. Yes, my question is just a brief comment. We are just talking about the recovery in the world, and this both things go parallelly, especially when we are recovering from the pandemic, and the side by side we are shifting towards the green economy, and a lot of costs is supposed to paid by the least developed countries like Pakistan. So how this this formula will be fit in that, because we have to work a lot on this. But I think pandemic itself is a blessing, which is providing us opportunity to revisit our process systems, especially when we are thirsty for the energy. But it is good time. A little break of pandemic is making us to foresee the future towards a global sustainable development. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Atif. There's another question from the Philippines, Ms. Marie Aquila, to Mr. Dwal. She has written in the chat box. The question is, can you talk about the advantages and disadvantages of incorporating dispute settlement provisions in any environment-related WTO agreement? Mr. Dwal? The question is for Mr. Dwal.
Yes, I'm sure her may actually be a better position for me to answer that particular question. So I might defer to him. But I just wanted to touch on the point on how do you pay for all for the green economy, right? I mean, for this switch to greener trade, and I think this remains an issue. Yes, in a way, it can pay for itself to some extent. Because there is some business opportunity, as I think Mr. Suresh highlighted, right? In producing more sustainably and more, there is a demand for green products and things like that. One of the things we mentioned in the report refers to the importance of for governments to promote sustainable finance, right? And encourage, for example, there is a lot of demand in the private sector and in the financial markets about funding sustainable companies who actually report on their emissions, who monitor their emissions correctly, and things like that. And there is a huge boom in the financial sector related to sustainable finance. So I think this is one way in which some of the resources to finance this green transformation, because it's going to cost money, will come from. Let me stop here. Do you want to try to answer that questions from Philippines?
Maybe I can try to help out. No, I think just a couple of positions. I mean, when one says WTO agreement, I take it to mean the existing agreements under the WTO. So the existing agreements under the WTO actually do not have a specific environment-related provision. What we have is actually an exception that already exists. It's called Article 20, exception in the GATT, that covers all situations whereby a member may be taking a measure which would normally not be compatible with WTO rules, but because they're taking that measure for an environmental objective, and provided that they are doing so in a way which is non-discriminatory and not arbitrary, they use this exception. The non-discriminatory part requires a little bit more discussion and understanding, but the basic point is that you already have that provision. You already can use it within the WTO context. It's a bit different from what you're seeing in regional trade agreements. Regional trade agreements, which are outside the WTO, are taking one step further. They are developing environmental obligations, which are more positive obligations, like things that you must be doing. And then the question arises, in the failure of doing these things, will there or will there not be dispute settlement? Will it kick in? There's no one single formula currently. I think one can say that you have a big variety. Some regional trade agreements have no dispute settlement provisions linked to environmental obligations. A few start to have these. The traditional ones are NAFTA, would of course have this. You have the EU agreements. Some of them do have certain environment-related provisions. And it's an open question, the pros and cons, you know. I think one has to look at it on a case by case. And actually it's a subject for more research, I would say. I don't know if that can help clarify a bit the question.
Thank you, Mr. Lim. And there's another question by Mr. Govinda Bahadur Kharki. Would you like to?
Yeah, thank you very much, madam, for giving me this opportunity to raise a small question. I'm Govinda Kharki, Joint Secretary in the Ministry of Industry and Commerce and Supplies in Nepal. My one small question for Professor Liu, Xiangkun Liu. In its presentation, I saw one statistics where the graph of carbon intensive fuel is taller than the environmental goods. Of course, it is in average from and it is related to tariff. But my doubt, my suspicion is that there is a increased number of population. I mean, percentage of Nepali people who have access to green energy, that is hydropower, is increasing so significantly in recent years. If this is the case, why this graph, that carbon related graph, is taller than the environmental goods? That is my question. And what is the data sources to come up with this data? Thank you very much.
I think probably you're referring to my presentation, I would guess, right? There is one graph where we show environmental average tariffs on environmental goods versus average tariff on fossil fuels, right? So I think the question is, I mean, actually Nepal is doing very well in the sense of green energy, right? Because you have a lot of hydropower, like you said, right? So actually for you, the tariff, this issue is less important, right? Because you've got this very big, green source of energy, right? So I think Nepal is doing fine. This is just tariff data, right, on fossil fuels. So this comes from the World Bank World Integrated Trade System, right, WITS. And so this is just data looking at what tariff you put on fossil fuels. So, on oil, I don't know what, I will have to look at what it is, right? Versus what is the tariff on some of the environmental goods. And so again, the environmental goods here is not just energy. It's actually a range of environmental goods. And the list of environmental goods we use is essentially the APEC, a list of environmental goods from the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, extended a little bit, because again, as we discussed, there is no one agreed list of environmental goods. So I hope that clarifies.
Okay, thank you, sir.
And I'm just told actually that the tariff, I mean, I think the fossil fuel includes coal, right? And so on your side, I think Nepal apparently is importing coal, right? Is that correct?
No, I think there is not much consumption of coal. Of course we have, but you know, in the past, our traditional domestic energy was wood, firewood, but now this situation also has significantly improved, and we don't have.
Yeah, exactly.
Much, yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So your tariff on coal is high, but your consumption and your import on coal is very low because you've got access to other green energies. So that's very good for you.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, are there any more questions? I think if there are no more questions, you know, directed to the presenters, maybe you could give a brief, very briefly share your reflections on today's topic, Mr. Duval and Mr. Lim. Would you like to, Mr. Lim? Would you like to share your reflections, you know, before we end the session?
Well, no, thanks very much, and thanks for this very interesting discussion. I think there was one question I saw in the chat box from the colleague from Vietnam about vaccination rates between countries. I'm not sure whether I fully understood the question, but I think it's a significant factor. I mean, something to say about. You know, certainly the gap in vaccination rates between countries will have an impact. I mean, we know that COVID-19 has an impact on supply chains. This is a big impact. We know that COVID-19 has an impact on the movement of people to start with. So if there are gaps in vaccination rates, from a health perspective, it's really, really sad, and we would like to see that addressed. And certainly, I think that would also have an impact on economic integration, I would imagine. But that's very, very sort of broad answer. My more immediate sort of points to the panel is that I would encourage, you know, ESCAP, you to continue this type of discussion. It seems to me that these are issues that are going to continue, and they are intensifying. And behind all of this, one needs to keep in mind that it goes beyond trade. I mean, trade is a big part of it, a big component of it. But certainly, I think, as you said yourself, Madam Moderator, in the beginning, that you know the impact of climate change on the planet as a whole is such a serious one that unless we take some action, you know, the IPCC report suggests that, you know, rates of climate will continue, temperatures will continue to increase, and this will have quite devastating impacts on all countries. And just a small link to COVID-19, I mean, some research has suggested that the links between climate impacts and viruses are also on the rise, because at the end of the day, a lot of viruses emerge from the environment, and climate impacts will make it even more likely to have more viruses circulating. So it's very big considerations, and to the extent that trade can play a positive role is very much where most of our discussions are at currently, to try to demonstrate that trade can play a positive role in this area. So thank you.
All right. So, yeah, on my end, I mean, I think I wanted to highlight the Secretary General, UN Secretary General concept of networked multilateralism, right? And actually, I had to make a presentation on this, so I had to look into it, right, a little bit. And I think the concept is very nice because it's really, yes, it's not all about trade, it's not all about health, it's not all about labor, it's not all those things needs to be looked at together in an integrated manner. So it's very easy to say, it's very difficult to do. And so when you start looking at trade and climate change, WTO is involved, the UN system is involved in a big way, right? So you need to bring all those stakeholders together. This is one dimension of network multilateralism. The other dimension of network multilateralism is regional and multilateral and sometimes, you know, plurilateral. And so, for example, in the report, because we are ESCAP or Asia Pacific, we look more at the regional trade agreements. Right? But I think a lot of insights from regional trade agreements discussion on climate, on environment in the regional trade agreements level can feed into the WTO. And so I think more of that, more of those synergies hopefully should be, could be tapped. And then ultimately there is a need to move from provisions that are non-binding to a little bit more binding level of provisions, right? And so, and this can be done actually probably through the WTO more if the WTO dispute settlement system, since this was mentioned, right, can be revitalized in the coming ministerial. So let me end with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both the presenters, and it's been, you know, very insightful and very timely discussion on a topic that's very relevant for this time. So this brings us to the end of today's discussions, and while thanking everyone for participating, I'll hand over to the MC, Miss Mia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Huda Ali Sharif, for moderating, and to my good friends and colleagues, Holim and Jan, for excellent presentations, as well as probing questions from the participants that helped us, you know, dig out some other issues that are so important in this area of trade, climate change, environment. The work will be ongoing, and so hopefully the region, as it hosts the largest emitters and also the largest producers and users of maybe these damaging sources of energy, plus you know, creators of this plastic waste and everything, the region will need to sort of start walking the talk and contributing to finding the solutions, binding or otherwise. And so hopefully, you know, while we really appreciate that the head of agencies are agreeing on certain avenues and parts and putting in place concrete actions, what we really need is for the heads of states to start agreeing along the same way. So with this, we have concluded this fourth session in the event, and we are at the end of day 2 of our regional consultations. So I will kindly ask my colleague Vitada Anukonvataka to say a few words about today, and perhaps to announce what's going to happen tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mia, and congratulate all the speakers and participants of this second day of the regional consultation workshops. We have very insightful and engaging discussions going into many diverse topics, but is a lot of interesting discussions on the work in progress of WTO, as well as what have been going on inside the countries. As you already seen in the breakout sessions and the main sessions today, a lot of initiatives at the country level on e-commerce, investment facilitations, MSMEs, and the climate issues has been ongoing in resonate to what the country are doing with multilateral negotiations. So that would lead us to the next sessions tomorrow, which will be related to, again, very important issues, which we will talking about special differential treatment, which is very important for the members with the LDC status, and the very much awaited sessions, the roundtable discussions on the way forward. We will have many high-level panelists to discuss views on the various aspects of process toward the WTO to fit for the 21st century agenda and sustainable development. So that will happen tomorrow, and I hope everyone today will be join us tomorrow at 1:30 p.m. Bangkok time. With that, I wish all of you would have very pleasant the rest of the day, and I will see you again tomorrow. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.